Hi everyone, my name is John Sokolowski. Just wanted to thank you for your interest in the Feminist War Games game jam. I'd like to offer these as introductory provocations, so you can start thinking about what you might do during the game jam time. A year ago, I gave an art gallery talk on unconventional representations of war in video games and focused on games which eroded the standard tropes of heroic and ideologically driven soldiers, glorified violence, normative Western perspectives, and good versus evil binaries. In the question and answer section, an audience member asked a simple but profound question. She recognized that unconventional or not, most of the games that I was using as examples, like Quest for Bush, September 12th, Spec Ops The Line, Unmanned, and This War of Mine, were still operating within the frame of masculine power fantasies, even as they questioned the locations of power at the heart of more traditional representations of armed conflict. She asked, "Is there a feminist war game?" I was in an absolute loss, and I had no answer for her. A year later, I still have no definite answer, but have amassed a fair amount of research and thinking that provides a foundation to build upon and has also generated a cascade of further questions. However, all the writing and talking I've done about this question aren't enough. These questions are bigger than me and my capabilities. This conversation needs to emerge through prototypical argumentation, through the creation of provocative game spaces that variously illuminate the opportunities and challenges at the heart of such questions. It's interesting that critics are often not seen as adequate game designers, or more importantly, that game designers aren't often associated with critical thinkers who can bring feminist values to games. So in the hopes of undermining such a perspective, this provocation calls for critical thinkers to apply feminist values to the design of their games. And in this case, we're focusing on war games because they're the most counterintuitive site for the manifestation of feminist values. Feminism, war, and game. These three terms are really difficult to define. I'm not going to try to define them exhaustively, but again, provocatively. So hopefully we can start thinking about those. So first, the question, what is war? It would be easy to make this into the broadest possible category by simply equating war with conflict. Conflict is inherent in all stories and all narratives. But to make things more focused, though, I'd like to suggest that we understand war, in this case, as armed conflict, more specifically. Or, alternatively, another definition that parallels the first, but also calls attention to the economic aspects of war, is seeing war as a violent form of resource management and acquisition, which then helps to understand its relationship with games. While this game jam challenge requires such a general understanding of war, there are so many historical examples that could be appealed to. So in most of these examples, systems and practices of war have been traditionally controlled by men, and many have resulted in oppressed and victimized women. Any exceptions to this, though, could provide opportunities to assert and foreground alternative perspectives. At the beginning of every Fallout game, the most recent of which, Fallout 4, was just released a little while ago, the statement "war never changes" is used to begin the narrative. Through this project and game jam, I'm hoping that we can turn that statement into a question. So moving on to the idea of what is a game, which is about as equally a complicated question as what is war, I'd like to offer some thoughts on games from Merritt Kopus from a keynote talk for the 2014 Queerness in Games Conference. Kopus suggests that some games are cultural fantasies of the way things work. Through play, not just through representations or images, we tell stories about how we believe or want to believe the world works. Kopus goes on to suggest that all games are abstractions, and all abstractions involve human and thus political decisions about what to include or emphasize. In the context of digital games where the rules can be selectively concealed from the player, these decisions are invisibilized and naturalized. And finally, Kopus quotes Paolo Perricini by suggesting that Perricini points out that most video games place the player in a relatively straightforward scenario with clear goals. The overwhelming focus on goals, efficiency, and accomplishment in video games has led him to describe the medium, says Perricini, as the aesthetic form of rationalization. So I think all these are useful and necessary provocations towards thinking about how a game functions, specifically in this context. Games, specifically digital iterations of games, involve a complexity of features, including systems, mechanics, controls, sound, visuals, narrativity, interfaces, and a whole bunch more. Games are essentially training arenas, which demand that we conform to prescribed algorithms or rule sets of action and achievement, but some also allow opportunities for flexible play. And actually some also demand that we become lucid players. We wake up in the middle of the dream and become conscious of what our actions are all about. Some even creatively antagonize player expectations or work to alienate a player's innate trust in reliable narration. Each of these elements of games offers an opportunity, I think, for feminist intervention. For example, what would a feminist game mechanic look like, and how could it be applied to a war game? Feminism, like war or games, is broad as well. So to avoid alienating different perspectives on the spectrum of feminist discourse, and to retain the integrated complexity of feminist iterations, I think the most effective approach is through feminist values. I've been inspired recently by the work of Mary Flanagan and Helen Nissenbaum, whose book Values at Play focuses on value-centric game design. Their argument has three main premises. Societies have common values, though these value systems are by no means simple or consistent. Number two, that technologies embody ethical and political values. And three, that designers have the power to shape players' engagement with such values. I think overall this approach to game design through value-centric sort of design understanding really enables game designers in fundamental ways. Nissenbaum and Flanagan assert that authors identify where and how values exist in games, offering an excellent breakdown of the features of a game's systematic architecture that generate meaning. Then they offer a practical values at play heuristic that involves the discovery, implementation, and verification of game values throughout an iterative process of design. So what are feminist values? This list is woefully inadequate. It involves a lot of pro and anti-labeling, and it's a beginning. It's a beginning thought. Given that feminism describes and consolidates a collection of related movements, is there a common denominator value between all versions of feminism? Legal equality, egalitarian ideas that respect individual and or categorical differences, but which maintain value and opportunity within a social context? Or is there more to this? The necessity of resistance or counterpoint to the dominance or exclusive prevalence of patriarchal and masculine paradigms is perhaps an essential value. But I'm not here to define essential values of feminism. Again, this is a provocative beginning to the kinds of values, hopefully, that you'll bring to your prototype in the game jam. All right. Further, how can feminist values be incorporated into a game? Perhaps feminism needs to be applied here as a method of design, as an ideological design influence, as a lens through which designers and players interact with arenas of war. On this slide, I've got examples raised by Anita Sarkeesian of moments in which, or opportunities in which, feminist values have appeared in games, and unfortunately these moments are all too far and few between. But ignoring the arena of games for a moment, what's the relationship between feminism and war? I've included two quotations that just scratch the surface of this existing critical conversation. Cynthia Coburn, in her article, What Kind of Feminism Does War Provoke?, which discusses anti-war feminism as a critique of the meaning and operation of power, observes that war dramatically enhances men's authority. It exacerbates the sexual violence women experience from men in times of so-called peace. And a further provocative quotation is that from Dale Spender, is that feminism has fought no wars. It has killed no opponents. It has set up no concentration camps, starved no enemies, practiced no cruelties. So this quote, attributed to Dale Spender, reveals a telling difference between war and feminist practices. So what's the relationship between feminism and conflict? Feminism arises out of conflict, and a search for solutions to binary and hierarchical considerations of the sexes and social or cultural application and reinforcement of such a binary. Another question, what is the nature of conflict resolution in many or most war games? One side wins. Is competition at the heart of war games as well? How does competition relate to feminism? And finally, can feminist approaches, economies, and values change, alter, skew, distort, or reimagine our habitual perceptions of armed conflict or the resolution of violent conflict? Moving on to considerations of war games. There are so many types of war games and many expectations or habits that have been generated by repetitive design assumptions and stereotypical narratives. To make war entertaining, many games have relied on abstractions, such as chess or strategy, resource management games in general, or heroic individualism, perseverance, and triumph against the odds, similar to the way that war was romantically remediated in many American films of the late 40s and early 50s. In a February 2015 escapist article entitled "Forget Realism, We Need Truth," Robert Rath offered an interesting criticism of war games, writing, "I'm not sure there's another medium that's dealt with war so much while saying so little about it." And Merritt Kopus, again, points out that through play, not just through representations or images, we tell stories about how we believe or want to believe the world works. For instance, authors like Darius Kazemi and Robert Yang have pointed out that war games are less accurate descriptions of the conduct of contemporary warfare and more a projection of ideas and cultural fantasies about war and heroism. In this slide, I've tried to introduce a few differences between how games differ from war, and then show that, interestingly, most contemporary politicians, while they often appeal to such abstractions, also try to pull us back from these misunderstandings of war. But no matter the differences, these all feed masculine power fantasies. Are there alternatives that are guided or could be guided by feminist values? An example or food for thought, in addition to the ones on the slide. A Counter-Strike mod brought armed conflict deathmatch to the setting of the nonviolent game Gone Home, a game that Anita Sarkeesian highlighted as a prime example of a feminist game. This is what happens when we bring combative masculine power fantasies to a space that has been defined by other motivations. So what are the effects of this? How does mapping these actions onto an environment that initially promoted other values and motivations affect our experience of that space and those memories? What would be the effects of doing the opposite, bringing feminist values to spaces and genres that haven't been designed to support such a weight? Exploring the possibility of feminist war games essentially asks whether war itself is a masculine practice, concept, strategy, or response to difference. And this is an important question to ask. So the idea of a feminist war game initially causes cognitive dissonance from its inherent paradoxes. How can armed conflict and feminism be compatible, especially in historical time where some of the more radical feminist approaches have been transformed into less confrontational strategies? But my enthusiasm for this question has been boosted by seeing Mad Max Fury Road, the movie. While this movie could be criticized for reinforcing essentialist gender characteristics in some cases and maintaining an exploitative male gaze in many other cases, I'm tempted to identify this film as a feminist war movie, or at least a movie that attempts to incorporate feminist values into its perceptions and what it showcases. So, a couple reasons for this. This isn't just a movie about abused women escaping a world destroyed by men. It's a movie about these women turning around, confronting and overcoming such a world. It includes a broad, not exhaustive, but robust variation of female characters, age, function, purpose, and motivation. This film features female characters whose strength is based on more than simply possessing a few masculine traits. A wide range of identities are considered. And masculinity in Mad Max Fury Road is a toxic pollutant in this movie, turning everyone into things, property, functions, until Max shifts from fighting and combative reflexes to become a compassionate healer for Furiosa by giving blood rather than spilling it. But I think it's his time and his being influenced by his companions in company that perhaps motivate him to do that. The film features older matriarchs as well who match the men in aggression and strength, but who also carry the seeds of plants in the hopes of one day rejuvenating the wasteland. Women are thus represented, and perhaps reductively, but this is at least interesting to think about, as the carriers of fertile seeds and life rather than the male bringers of death who plant anti-seeds or bullets. The wives are also alternatives to war, strong and capable of fighting, but not warriors, advocating for no unnecessary death. And finally, the men in the film are all associated with war and death and destruction, and the tragedy of such activity. The warlords of Gastown and the Bullet Farm, which are centers of trade and resources, are old men who command war boys, adolescents who are promised divine resurrection for suicidal service and are thus brought into the circle, the toxic circle of masculinity. So if films focused on armed conflict can explore, maybe not conclusively or anything more than at least exploratory, can explore feminist values and confront masculinist tropes, then why not games? Now, the irony of this, of course, is that the Mad Max game focuses on combat and bloody car customization. So what would a feminist war game look like? And maybe, more importantly, should there be feminist war games? Perhaps looking to create a feminist war game is not doing enough to problematize and undermine the masculinist and patriarchal foundation that generate and reinforce such binary oppositions. Perhaps Judith Butler's ideas of gender fluidity are more important to assert here, to redefine and unmoor parameters rather than shifting perspectives. If queer game cultures seek to promote heteronormativity, then is this perhaps a better strategy? To inherently avoid the discourse of masculine and feminine gender binaries, to discard terms like masculinist and feminist and patriarchy and matriarchy? Is even the use of masculine power fantasies still subscribing to an outmoded way of perceiving or mapping the gender landscape? Or do we need to assert these markers and their counterpoints to achieve their erosion? I think that feminism remains a necessary perspective and approach because inequity and oppressive patriarchal habits persist and are becoming horrifically amplified in situations of war. Feminist efforts can effectively queer patriarchal landscapes and thus have the power to challenge normative myths about war and to transform perspectives. So to conclude, a provocation from Maddie Bryce's Queer as in Fuck Me, a design manifesto. Games themselves aren't teaching values, rather teaching players to have capacities for certain kinds of values through discipline. So we need to design games as prompts for reaction and creation instead of teaching specific parables and lessons. So hopefully that's been enough of a provocation. This accompanies the one-pager as well, and I really look forward to meeting all of you and to seeing what you come up with at the Feminist War Game Jam. Thank you very much.